Now, as they're getting their seats, I will remind you that if you've been with us the last few weeks, you might remember that we have been engaged in a series really asking the question that we've been kind of hitting at all day of what does it look like for us to make a dent in the lives of other people? Like very practically, how do we do that? How do we replicate what Jesus did? And specifically what we're doing is we're looking at a series that kind of unpacks 5 ways Jesus loved people. And the 5 ways are outlined in this little book, which you can grab a copy of on your way in or out or whatever you want. And as I've said several times, I find this book genius for several reasons. One, I think the stories are super engaging, they're funny, they're thoughtful, they're practical, but I think that what the true genius of the book is the way they were able to take these 5 practices of Jesus and turn them into a really catchy acronym. And so what we have here is this acronym, and this morning, because we've been talking about it for like 3 weeks now, I want to see how well you're doing on this. And so, Jordan, can you throw it up here? Now, who remembers what the B stands for? Begin with prayer. Well done. What about the L? Listen. The E? Eat. S? Second S? Share. Share. That's great. That's impressive. And so here's the concept behind these blessed practices. How did Jesus love people? He prayed for them, he listened to them, he ate with them, he served them, and he shared hope with them. How can you bless somebody today? How can you love them? Well, you pray for them, you listen to them, eat with them, serve them, share your faith. See how that fits? Now, last week we talked about the importance of beginning with prayer, how prayer gets us in sync with God, how it helps us to see the world as He does, and then it also aligns us to say, okay, God, what do you want us to do? What is your will? How do I follow your will? Today, I want to look at that second practice of listening and begin to ask, so what is the power of listening? Why does listening matter? Now, I'm going to tell you right now, this listening one is interesting. And it's interesting because I think of all the practices, this is probably the hardest, or at least it's becoming the hardest in our culture. And there's a number of reasons for that, but I think the short of it is we live in a society that is increasingly quicker to speak than we are to listen. In fact, as I was prepping for this, I was just, looking up thinkers on the subject and trying to see what's in the world, what are they talking about? And I came across these TED Talks by a guy named Julian Treasure. And I thought these talks were fantastic. Julian Treasure has written several books on the topic of communication and the importance of it. And if you were to Google him or put him into YouTube, these are his 2 videos. How to speak so that people want to listen, and 5 ways to listen better. Both are really good, but what's really indicative of our culture is the amount of views each video has received. That first one, how to speak so that people want to listen, 31 million views. Whereas how to listen well, 3.5 million views. In other words, people are 10 times more interested in being heard than they are in hearing other people and what they have to say. That's fascinating to me. But that's not the only thing. In fact, if you were to look just over the last couple hundred years of what I'll call cultural shifts or societal shifts, there's a lot of reasons that we struggle to listen well. I mean, just think, first of all the inventions that have been relatively recent that have kind of helped us record things. So if you think about this, or transfer information, if you think about this, back in the ancient days, the way you would pass on stories is you would do it orally, right? You'd sit around the campfire and you're passing on stories after stories. And then somebody got the great idea, hey, we should write these stories down. That's a genius idea. And then the next time, somebody said, you know what? We can do even better than this. We can audibly record things. We can scratch it into a record, or we can put it on tape, or whatever it is. And then, more recently, we've moved into video recording. And then even more impressively, we've now moved to digital recording, so much so that we can take pretty much all of the world's information and shove it into a pocket that you can easily access at any time. But why that's a big deal, if you think about it, is those subtle cultural shifts have taken the premium on listening well. The importance of listening carefully and accurately, and it has essentially vanished. Because if I didn't hear what you said, all I got to do is rewind the tape, right? If I wanted to understand what somebody said, I can pull it up on YouTube. I don't need to actually listen carefully anymore, because if I need to get something, I can go and find it somewhere else. Well, that's a big deal. Another significant cultural shift that has taken place is, if you just look over the last couple hundred years, the amount of noise that has hit our world, both audibly and visually, has increased exponentially. I mentioned this summer, but I think it bears repeating, that it was shown that in the 70s, or it was estimated that in the 70s, the average person saw between 500 to 1,600 advertisements per day. 500 to 1,600. That's quite a bit. By the year 2006, that number had climbed to 5,000 ads per day. And the reason 2006 is important is because in January of 2007, the iPhone came out. And when the iPhone came out, it changed everything. And so what we were at about 5,000, it's estimated that today the average person sees over 10,000 ads per day. Now you take that along with all the t-shirts that you see, along with all the tweets that you read, the memes that you scroll through, the Facebook posts, and then the seemingly everyday water cooler talk. The amount of information you are hit with on a daily basis is insane. It's impossible to absorb. There's no way you can take it in. It's exhausting. And this has led to a third cultural shift that's a fairly recent development, is because of all the noise, we've adapted to essentially tune it out. And the way we do that is twofold. One, we do it literally by putting headphones in our ears, right? And it's our way of just kind of zoning out the world around us so we can focus a little better. But also, we have metaphorical headphones. We put on strong filters where we only listen to certain voices of people who share our values and our view of the world or our belief systems. And the reason those are helpful is because it allows us to actually catch the stuff that matters in our life, right? There's a lot of times where you'll be going through the day and you're like, I didn't even hear about that. It's because your filters kind of prevented you from hearing that. But that's also good because it usually draws attention to some things. Now, obviously, the negative side of that is because we have these filters on, these headphones on, we're prevented from hearing the broader soundscape. And often we ignore voices that are contrary to what we currently think or believe. Even if they're true and we're wrong, we don't care. There's just too much noise for us to decipher, so we try and simplify our lives. This is fascinating. Now, if you take this one step further and you just step back and say, okay, so what is the effect of these cultural shifts? What is the effect of having inventions that help us record things better? What is the effect of all the noise and the effect of people putting on headphones? If you were to step back and look, society as a whole, or at least American society, has become far more impatient. We have lost the art of sitting and waiting. Instead, we're constantly going, yeah, get to the point. Hurry it up, pastor. Come on, 35 minutes? I don't think so. I think you can do that in 20. Get to it. Right? But even more than that, you ever found yourself, you're reading an article, and what do? You read the first couple paragraphs, and then you jump to the bottom, right? You don't have time for all that fluff in the middle. Let's get to it. In fact, I follow a number of blogs, and I love that the emails that I receive have been shortened to like bullet points. Like you can read all the words. I don't read them. I just read the bullet points. And the same thing with videos, right? When I'm watching a video, a TED Talk or whatever it is, I usually just skip to the end. Or worse, I just skip to the comment section and get the summary by somebody else. I don't have time for this. We've become way more impatient. As part of that as well, we've lost the beauty of oratory. We don't like to sit in arguments, complex ideas anymore. We like sound bites. We like tweets. We like memes. In fact, they become far more impactful than long drawn-out arguments. And this is interesting even in our political debates, right? They're constantly, as politicians, trying to boil it down to the soundbite. It doesn't mean they don't understand the complexity. They just don't think you care. So they just give you the soundbite anymore. And that's true. That's shocking. A more insidious version of this, though, because we've been bombarded by all the news, is we've become desensitized to much of the brokenness around us. Every day we hear about some shooting, some bombing, some horrible tragedy. And instead of being disgusted by the tragedy around us. We usually, at best, we go, sad. And then we move on, right? We've just become so desensitized to the horrors of life. It's awful. I think one other insidious effect of these cultural shifts that have hit us is that we have lost the art of conversation and we've replaced it with the art of personal broadcasting. And again, this is seen very much in our politics, right? They don't talk at each other, they talk past each other. And they're constantly trying to one-up each other. And you see this again also on Facebook, on yard signs or whatever it is. Really, our goal is just to make our point and then be affirmed by the people who agree with us, but we're not actually trying to win a debate. We're not actually trying to understand. We're not trying to come to some sort of common ground anymore. Another example of this is, you ever engaged in a conversation with somebody and found yourself spending more time trying to figure out how to respond to them than actually listening to what they say? Right? You're just waiting, like, I just can't wait for me to butt in, but. We're not actually engaged in dialogue or discourse or discussion. It's just waiting turns to talk. These are some of the effects that have taken place, and so clearly we have a problem. Now, obviously, if you were to know history in some way, and even just biblically, we see this, cultures have always struggled with listening well. In fact, 3,000 years ago, Solomon makes this point several times in the Proverbs where he just calls this kind of listening foolish. Foolish. But the point is, while this has always been a problem, it's getting worse. We are getting worse and worse at listening well. And why that matters is because if you have ever experienced this where you've tried to open yourself up, where you've tried to become vulnerable, where you've tried to bare your soul to another person for them only to brush you off, to ignore what you're saying, or worse, interject and tell you what you need to do to go fix yourself before they actually understood you, you know how unloving that is. On the flip side, you've also experienced the positive, right? I assume many of you have had these moments where you have opened up and somebody slowed down and they took the time to genuinely listen to you, to look you in the eyes, to understand what you are saying, to understand what you are feeling, to respond back and clarify, to genuinely know you and hear you. That is easily one of the most loving things you can do for another person. And yet, as we said, it's not very common. In fact, what I thought was really fascinating, because we've been doing this study as a staff, this was a few weeks ago, and I asked the question, hey, how many of you can point to a time when you felt loved like that, where you felt really heard? And I want to say it was like half the room was like, yeah, when my therapist sat with me. Isn't it sad? Like, we have to pay people to listen to us this way. And yet what we see in the person of Jesus is someone who genuinely loved us so much that he wanted to understand us. He wanted to know us. He wanted to hear us. In fact, this is part of the reason he condescends. This is part of the reason he takes on flesh and dwells among us, is that he wants to understand us. He wants to know what's going on. But also, one of the other things that's often super overlooked in the life of Jesus is just how often the guy asks questions. So in his book, Martin Coperhaver, and the book is called Jesus is the Question, he identifies 307 questions asked by Jesus. Jesus asked 307 questions. And what's really interesting is if you look at these questions, they're not limited to like a particular season in his life. It wasn't just like, oh, this is like the heavy miracle question phase, or this is the prep for death question phase. Like, no. What we see is over the totality of Jesus' life, his constant posture was one of inquisitive nature. He was constantly asking questions. In fact, if you go back and you go to like Luke 2, where we get the youngest speech of Jesus, right? Luke 2 is Jesus and his family. Jesus is probably like a teenager, or better yet, he's probably like a junior high kid, 11, 12 years old. His family, they drive down to Jerusalem. That's right, drive down in a caravan. Walk down in Jerusalem in this big grouping, and when they get there, they celebrate the Passover festival, and then they head home. Now, they probably did this in a group of 50 people, and they just assume Jesus, 11-year-old boy, he's probably hanging out with the other 11-year-old boys. So they walk all day without seeing their kid. Then they sit down for dinner at night, and then they start going to the neighbors. Hey, you seen Jesus? You You seen Jesus? You seen Jesus? They go, no, I haven't seen. I thought he was with so-and-so. I thought he was with so-and-so. Nope. Shoot. We left Jesus back in Jerusalem. So then they take the next day, they walk all the way back to Jerusalem. They don't find him that night. Then the third day, they get up and they start scouring the city. And eventually they find him, and they find him in the temple. And this is what they ask him. They say, and this is Luke chapter 2, verse 49. He says, why were you searching for me? Realize this. This is the first words out of Jesus' mouth. Youngest speech we have recorded. Notice what he says. Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? First thing out of his mouth is a question. What's interesting is if you flip to Matthew's gospel, the last thing out of his mouth before he dies is another question. My God, why have you forsaken me? And then what's again interesting is if you look is after his death, after his resurrection, in a time where you would think if anybody has the right to lecture other people, if anybody has the right to talk, or anybody should just be heard or listened to rather than ask questions, you'd think it'd be after they come back from the dead, right? But that's not at all what we see with Jesus. Instead, what we see is he asks more questions. On the road to Emmaus, Luke 24, he asks his disciples, hey, what are you guys talking about? Anything going on? Anything going on? And they're like, haven't you heard about the news in Jerusalem? And he goes, no, what news? Tell me about it. What? Like, he's the guy. He's the news. And he doesn't ask the questions. Another one is later, like right after this, he gets to the locked room where the disciples are all huddled up. And what does he do? You guys got anything to eat? You got anything to eat around here? Like, it's great. And then this famous one, right on the shores of Galilee, Jesus asked Peter, Peter, do you love me? 3 times, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Powerful questions. Again, what we see over and over in the life of Jesus is that he constantly took the posture of asking questions. In fact, this is, again, super fascinating. So I told you Jesus asked about 307 questions. Well, what Copenhaver also found in his book is that Jesus was asked about 187 questions. 187 questions. But of the 187 questions asked of Jesus, you know how many he responded to directly? 8. And even that's a debate. Some people say 3, most people say 8. There's a debate about how directly he answered a question. But the point is this: Jesus is 40 times more likely to ask you a question than he is to give you a direct answer. Or put it another way, Jesus is 40 times more likely to seek to understand you than he is to be understood by you. That is fascinating to me. And why this matters is Copenhaver kind of concludes this well in his book. He says Jesus is the ultimate answer man. He's the great questioner. Contrary to how Jesus is often portrayed, he does not offer us spiritual tips. He does not give us a neat list of 10 ways to be closer to God. He does not provide easy answers. Instead, what we see is he asks hard questions. And not just any kind of hard questions. The questions Jesus repeatedly asks are ones that always are the basis for further reflection, that push us into layers of greater depth and complexity. I mean, think about it. These are just some of the questions Jesus asks over the course of his ministry. In the Gospel of John, the first thing he says is, who or what are you looking for? Now, on one level, you look at that and you go, okay, there's a base answer to that. I'm looking for this. Is that really what you're looking for? Another one, why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? Who do you say that I am? Can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to the span of your life? I love this one. And why do you worry about clothes again? I don't get that one. It's simple. But Jesus is a guy here. Totally get this, right? He's like the Mark Zuckerberg of clothing. You just wear the hoodie all day long. Doesn't matter. And I love this one. This one's my favorite question. This is the one he asks people, like when the paralytic is laid in front of him, or the blind man begs him, have mercy on me. Like, you read that story, you know what they want. Right? And Jesus is no dummy, and yet why does he ask, what do you want me to do for you? Again, the point is what we see in the posture of Jesus is someone who genuinely wants to know us, who wants to understand us. Jesus did not come here to lecture us. He did not come here to condemn us. He did not come here to say, well, here's some cheap platitudes about how to make it through life. No. Jesus' primary purpose was to come and draw near to us. See, what Jesus understood, and this is radical, is Jesus understood that you and I are complex creatures in desperate need of connection and intimacy. And therefore, above all else, what we need, if we want to truly be loved, is we need someone to take the time to slow down and hear us, know us, ask us questions so that we can be understood. This is radical. And as I said, this isn't just like one moment in Jesus' life. In fact, in the author of Hebrews, as he reflects on the life of Jesus, this is years after the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. He looks back at his great conclusion about who Jesus is he says Jesus was the ultimate high priest. He was far superior to everyone who came before him, from Abraham, Moses, Aaron, to all the prophets of old. Jesus far superior to all of them. He is the great high priest, the one who truly gets us. And therefore, in Hebrews chapter 4, this is what the author of Hebrews concludes. He says, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. Catch this. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet he did not sin. In other words, Jesus gets us. He knows us. He fully understands us. As the author of Hebrews looks at the life of Jesus, this is his great conclusion about who Jesus is and why he matters. Apart from everyone else in all of human history, Jesus gets you. Therefore, he says, let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, not with fear, not with hesitancy that he doesn't really want to know us, doesn't really care about us, that we're just kind of busying his workday. No, approach him with confidence so that we might receive mercy and find grace in our time of need. My brothers and sisters, I don't know how to make this more clear. What we see over and over in the person of Jesus is a God who genuinely, desperately desires to know you, to understand you, to hear what's going on in your life. And as I said, this is part of the reason he took on flesh and dwelt among us. But also what we see through the life of Jesus and through the abundance of questions is he is someone who is genuinely curious about the burdens of your life, who wants to hear what's frustrating you, what's confusing you, what's a pain in your life, just as much as he wants to hear your hopes, your desires, your dreams, your failures, your successes, your accomplishments, you name it. He wants to hear because he knows you matter. This is how Jesus loved us, was simply by listening to us. And therefore, if we are going to follow in his footsteps, if we are truly going to be Christians, his people, his disciples, if we are going to do what he did, the logical step for us is to listen to others in the exact same way, to slow down, to be intentional. And that's what brings us back to this second blessed practice, right? I know it seems so simple. It seems so basic. I just got to listen to somebody. Yes, it really is that revolutionary. It really is that profound. You can have a significant, substantial dent in somebody's life by simply slowing down and simply trying to say, how do I understand you? What are you saying? What are you feeling? Who are you? What do you want out of life? They're incredibly basic questions, but incredibly simple ways to enter in to understand. But as we said, this thing's not easy. We live in a culture that really does struggle to listen well. And the deck is stacked against us. And many of us, this is not a skill we possess. Some of us are a little better at it than others, right? My wife is a much better listener than I am. It's just a fact. She's also better looking than I am, but everybody knows that. She's got gifts, I don't. Point is, she's going to hate that I just said that, by the way. Point is, all of us have different skills, but for many of us, listening is not a great skill. It's not a great strength. But it is a skill we can get better at. In fact, that was one of the things I found as I was doing this research and trying to understand, so how do we listen well? There's a lot of YouTube videos out there on this, a lot of articles that I skimmed and got to the bottom because I didn't have time to read the whole thing, no. But also in this book, there's some really good practical advice about how to listen well. But I'll tell you, as I was looking at it, I think the thing that struck me as some of the most helpful, practical advice on how to listen well came out of one of those TED Talks I was talking about by Julian Treasure. And he argued that one of the most impactful ways you can improve your listening is to simply acknowledge your listening posture in the moment and adapt it based on the circumstance. Let me give you some examples of some listening postures. Can we throw those up real quick? So these are different ways that we tend to listen to people, right? Either you're actively listening or you're passively listening. Actively, you're trying to make sense of it. You're trying to break apart. You're trying to find the nuance and understand, right? Whereas passive is you're just kind of letting the noise hit you in some way, and you're just letting it kind of, well, how is this feeling in the midst of all of that? You're not engaging the nuance. Another way is reductive versus expansive. Reductive is saying, okay, what's the point, right? Like, what's the takeaway? How do I get to this? And that can be really helpful, but not when you're trying to solve, like, why do you feel a certain way? Usually you need to be a little more expansive. Well, help me understand that. Let's unpack that. Let's get to the bigger picture here. Another one is critical versus empathetic. Critical is, okay, I see a problem here. Empathetic is, I'm sorry you feel that way. I could see how you would feel that way. And the point is, all of us naturally shift our postures, right? Like, we all do this, right? When you are working out or you're mowing your lawn and you've got your headphones in and you're listening to music, odds are you're doing it passively. You're not really taking in the lyrics. You're not trying to understand how good the new Adele album is. I mean, it's going to be good. Let's be honest. Adele's amazing, okay? But you're not really parsing it. You're just trying to make sense of, you're just mowing your lawn and it's on as background noise. But when you go to your kid's piano recital, you can't really listen passively. You may want to, but you can't listen passively. You're engaged and you're hearing all the little mistakes, but she's trying or he's trying, and you're there and you are focused. You are engaged, right? So what Julian Treasure argues is, if we could just simply learn in every conversation we're in to identify the posture that we have and adapt it appropriately, he says that is one of the most powerful ways we can learn to listen better. And as I started reflecting on this, I think he missed a step. I think if we can not only learn to identify the posture that we have, but be able to say, what is the most loving thing I can do for this person in this moment, and then adapt your posture based on that, I think that would be revolutionary. So let me give you an example. Let's say somebody comes into your office. It's one of your workers, right? And they're just looking for an assigned task. Hey, I finished this report. What do you want me to do next? They probably don't want you to become expansive in that moment. Well, let's talk about why the company exists and what our 10-year strategy is and how all these reports matter and where you fit into the structure of society and what's going on in your deepest of hearts. It's like, dude, I just needed to know what I needed to do for the next 10 minutes, right? Like, give me something. Reductive in that moment would be very loving. That was what they were looking for. However, if they come into your office and you can clearly see they are struggling, they're like, yeah, here's the report. I'm going, it probably doesn't make sense to move into a reductive posture as much as it makes sense to move into an expansive. Hey, how are you doing? Is there something going on? What is it? I mean, Scott, I think you kind of nailed that with the Sarah example, right? Like, it'd be easy to be like, hi, I'm the principal. Let's move on. Let's go. No, but to simply pause, there's something more there. Let's unpack that. That's powerful. But depends on the circumstance, right? It's not always going to be the most loving thing. Also, the critical empathetic, I think this is the hardest because, truth be told, I don't really care for empathy. When I come to you for a problem, I'm not looking for empathy. I'm just weird. I totally acknowledge this. I like critical feedback. I like when somebody is just saying, hey, honest, here's to the point, this is what I see, boom. You don't need to worry about my feelings. I'm fine. I know I'm weird. I'm fine. Okay? Other people, though, that is the most unloving thing you can do to them. But to me, if you're like, well, let's just sit, oh, I could see how you feel that way. It's like, no, I don't have time for that. That's not loving to me. But to other people, it's like, they don't need to be critical. They don't need you to tell them what to do. So you got to kind of feel out your circumstance and you got to feel out the person, right, in that context. That being said, if you're being critical, be loving. Don't be a jerk about the whole thing. But do you see how if you can simply learn to identify these postures when you're engaged in a conversation and simply say, okay, what is the most loving thing this person needs right now? How can I make sure they are heard? And then adjust your posture based on that? Like, that's revolutionary. As I said, there's tons of other examples. There's plenty in the book, but there's plenty you can find on YouTube and other examples as well. But the point is, in all of this, we live in a society that is increasingly struggling with listening well. And yet what we see through the ministry of Jesus and what we've experienced in our own life is one of the most absolute loving things a person can do for you is to simply slow down and hear you, know you, understand you, empathize with you, even if you don't like it, to get you. It's what we see Jesus do, and therefore, if that's how he loved, that is how we should love. And as simple as it sounds, you have the opportunity today, this week, to make a meaningful, substantial dent in the life of somebody else, a transformative effect by just slowing down and listening to them. I know it's simple. Now, last week, as we started this series, I told you our goal as a church is that 200 of you would find one unchurched person this year, one unchurched person that you could genuinely love like Jesus. And so last week I told you if you could even begin to pray about who that person would be, and then what would it look like for you to regularly pray for them, whether that's at your dinner table or your bedtime thing or your devotional space, to regularly lift them before the Lord and say, Lord, can you take care of my friend? But also to pray, Lord, how would you like to work in my life to love that person? What does that person need today? Like, you can do that by praying for them. The second thing you can do for that unchurched person to show them the love of Christ, show them that they genuinely matter to you, is to listen to them. And I don't know what that's going to take for you to slow down this week to find that person. I know for me, it really is the intentional space of slowing down. I feel like I've got this huge list of things to do, and then it's like when I get to it, I'll call that person. But maybe it's flipping that and just saying, like, I know I've got this list, but today this person matters, so I'm going to take the time to prioritize them. And it's making the call. It's saying, hey, you want to go to lunch? You want to talk? But to just say, how are you doing? Genuinely. Kurt texted me this week, told me he was thinking about me. It meant a lot to me. Appreciate that. Those little things, it's simple, it's subtle. How are you doing? Right? You can do that. It's just a simple phone call. For others of you, it may be when you're engaged in conversations, even with your coworkers, to just simply catch your posture and say, like, okay, I'm very passively listening here to this person at the water cooler. I am not engaged. All right, Bob, tell me about your weekend. You went up north again. Whoopee. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just engaging hopefully you do it with a little more love than that. But that slight shift can be incredibly loving. You can make a dent. And I don't know what the Lord's going to do with that. I genuinely don't. That's kind of the exciting thing about this series. But I do know this, that when we step in line with Jesus, when we follow in his footsteps, when we do what he does, incredible things happen. We heard that simply through Operation Christmas Child and through Hand to Hand today. So imagine what would happen if 200 of you went out into this space and just simply listened to one person this week. Genuinely listen to them. Well, what could the Lord do? I don't know, but I want to hear about it. But I know it's hard. And therefore, this morning, as we head out, I want to just simply pray for us as we go into that space. So will you join me in prayer, and then we'll conclude with some worship. Father, you are a good God. And the beauty of your son Christ is just how relatable he is. If you were just in the clouds, if you were just from afar, I personally confess it would be hard to understand what it looks like to follow you, what it looks like to live as you lived, what it looks like to do what you wanted. I would have struggled. But it's amazing as we look at the life of your son, and just even in those 4 Gospels, to see the amount of questions he asked, or to see the fact that he constantly would just turn it around and want to know the person he was talking to rather than just lecture. It is mind-boggling. And yet, Lord, in our own lives, I think many of us struggle because we always feel the need to speak. We always feel the need to be heard, to be heard by other people, that our voice needs to matter. And yet, the one whose voice mattered more than anything else was more concerned about being heard or hearing than he was about being heard. It's mind-blowing. Father, we do recognize, though, how transformative that is, how revolutionary that would be for our society. And so, Lord, we pray as we head through those doors that we would do what you do, that we would love as you love, that we would listen as you have listened. But the deck's kind of stacked against us, Lord. We don't really know how. And we live in a culture that has kind of programmed us to operate in a different direction. But Lord, we pray that your Spirit would take hold of us, that you would give us a further sensitivity to the people around us, but also the nudge to sometimes shut our mouths and simply listen. And Lord, that through us, through your church, we just pray that the communities around us will be radically transformed with the hope and love of Christ. We ask all this in Jesus' precious, powerful, and holy name. All God's people said, amen.
We are